They tied up and beat an elderly woman right in her own home. But they didn't know who her son was. When Chuck Norris returned, the consequences were shocking. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you're watching this video from. The rain had begun just after sunset, steady and soft. The kind of rain that blanketed the town without fury, but with persistence. Droplets tapped against the roof in a constant rhythm, sliding down the windows in silver lines. The streets outside were nearly empty, only the occasional pair of headlights gliding past, hazy through the mist. The air smelled of damp earth and leaves, the world seemingly wrapped in a hush. Inside the small house on the edge of town, everything felt warm and steady, as though the walls themselves had been built to protect the woman who lived within them. The kitchen light was soft, glowing golden across polished wood, casting shadows on the collection of family photographs that lined the walls and shelves. The hum of the refrigerator mixed with the tick of the clock above the stove, two sounds that had long become a part of the home's heartbeat. Mrs. Norris stood at the counter with deliberate calmness, finishing her evening routine. Age had drawn silver into her hair and carved fine lines into her face, but her eyes still carried the clarity of a woman who had lived fully. She moved with quiet strength, a dish towel draped across her arm as she polished the last cup she had washed. The smell of tea leaves lingered in the air, mingling with the faint aroma of baked bread that still clung from the afternoon. She placed the cup onto the drying rack and turned to the small table near the window. As always, she had set 2 cups earlier without thinking, one for herself and one for her son. It was a habit she never quite broke, even when she knew he might not come that evening. The untouched second cup glistened in the light, steam long gone but the gesture intact, a quiet reminder of the bond that time and distance could never sever. She smiled faintly at her own predictability, shaking her head. Her gaze moved to the mantel in the living room, where frames of varying sizes told the story of her son's life. There was Chuck as a small boy, his serious eyes staring into the camera, and then as a young man, his expression full of determination. Photographs of him in martial arts uniforms, trophies raised high, medals gleaming. Some showed him on stages, in front of audiences, smiling as though nothing in the world could touch him. To her, though, he was never the legend or the name whispered with admiration. He was simply her boy, the one who had once run into this very kitchen drenched from the rain, laughing with a stubborn joy, the one who had promised her when he was still young, "I'll protect you, Mom, always." That promise had become a part of her, something she carried without needing to hear it again. Tonight she felt it especially strong, though she told herself it was just sentiment. He had promised to stop by when he was done with his day, and she looked forward to hearing his voice echo through the rooms. It had been too long since they had sat together without rush, without an audience, without the world demanding pieces of him. The rain outside deepened, the steady drizzle punctuated now and then by a low growl of thunder far in the distance. The sound was soothing, almost like a lullaby, and she allowed herself to lean back in her chair, listening. The stubborn rose bush by the porch swayed under the water's weight, yet it stood resilient as always. That plant, no matter the season, clung to life. She often thought of herself in it, bent but unbroken, weathering storms silently. For a long while she simply sat, sipping her tea, gazing at the play of light against the window. Peace was a rare gift, and she cherished it. But then a faint sound pulled her from her reverie, a creak, so soft it could have been the wood settling. She tilted her head slightly, listening. The house had always had its voices, the occasional pop of the beams, the moan of wind against the eaves. Still, something in the sound felt different, sharper. She rose slowly, the towel still in her hand, and stepped into the living room. The photographs greeted her like sentinels. The floorboards whispered under her weight. She paused, her breath held, then exhaled and smiled at herself. Age, she thought, always imagining. She turned back toward the kitchen, shaking her head. But outside, beyond the walls, shadows moved. 2 figures approached the house with careful steps, their outlines slick under the rain. One was tall and lean, his shoulders narrow but his posture sharp, like a crow always searching for scraps. The other was broader, thick in the arms and neck, his movements slower but weighted with brute force. They said nothing as they reached the edge of the porch. The lean one bent down, pulling a thin tool from his pocket, sliding it against the frame of the window. The other watched, his breath steaming in the cool night air. Inside, Mrs. Norris had returned to her chair, unaware of how near the night's storm was to truly breaking. She lifted her cup again, savoring the last warmth of the tea. The clock ticked softly, each second marking the calm before what was to come. She thought once more of her son, picturing him walking in with that familiar mixture of confidence and humility. The image filled her with comfort, but it was interrupted by another sound, louder this time, a faint metallic scrape against the glass. Her brow furrowed. That was no trick of the house. The rain continued to fall, steady, relentless, as though it wished to drown out the truth of what approached. But within the small home, the air shifted, carrying the first breath of unease. And though Mrs. Norris did not yet know it, the night that had begun with warmth and quiet would soon unravel into something far darker, a test of strength and protection, of promises made long ago and never forgotten. The storm outside pressed closer, and the shadows by the window leaned in. The scrape against the window came again, unmistakable this time, metallic and sharp, carried faintly beneath the steady percussion of rain. Mrs. Norris stiffened in her chair, her hand tightening around the handle of her teacup. She set it down slowly, every sense on edge now, straining against the quiet of her home. The clock ticked on, indifferent, and somewhere within the walls the pipes moaned softly, but her ears filtered those familiar noises away. This was different. This was alive. She rose, her joints aching faintly as she stood, and took a step toward the living room window. The curtain shifted under her touch, and she pulled it back only slightly. For an instant, nothing but the storm greeted her. Sheets of rain washed the porch, the glow of the porch light catching each drop like silver beads. Then, just as she was about to let the curtain fall, a darker movement slid against the shadows. A hunched figure, bent low, shoulder pressed against the side of the frame. Her heart clenched. Before she could draw breath to act, the quiet broke. A pop, a muted crack, and the window lifted on its old hinges. The frame groaned in protest, but it yielded. Cold air swept in first, carrying the smell of wet earth and the faint stink of sweat and stale cigarettes. Then came the men. The first climbed through with an ease born of practice, lean and wiry, his face narrow and hawkish. A black hood clung to his head, rain dripping down into his eyes, but he ignored it, his gaze already scanning the room with sharp intent. Behind him followed a larger man, his shoulders filling the window as he hauled himself inside. He landed heavily on the carpet, water dripping from his boots, and gave a low grunt of satisfaction. Mrs. Norris froze. She wanted to believe she was dreaming, that the storm had conjured phantoms, but the sound of their breathing and the sight of knives glinting in their hands cut through all doubt. The smaller one noticed her first, his lips stretched into a smile that carried no warmth. "Evening, Grandma," he said, voice oily and mocking. "Didn't mean to scare you. We're just stopping by." The larger one chuckled, low and mean. "Nice and cozy. Bet there's plenty worth taking." His eyes swept the shelves, the mantel, the photographs that chronicled decades of her life. He dismissed them with a glance focused only on what might carry value in his pockets. Mrs. Norris steadied herself, squaring her shoulders despite the hammering in her chest. "You don't belong here," she said firmly, her voice steadier than she felt. "Get out of my house before I call." The wiry one cut her off with a laugh, quick and sharp. "Before you call who? You think anyone's going to come running out here in this storm? No, lady, it's just us tonight." He lifted the knife slightly, the dull light catching on the blade. Her breath caught. Still, she did not step back. "Take whatever you want. Just leave me be." The big man grinned, showing yellowed teeth. "Oh, we'll take what we want, but we can't have you calling someone while we're busy, can we?" He moved quickly for his size, crossing the room in 2 strides. Before she could retreat, his heavy hand closed around her wrist and yanked her forward. She gasped, struggling, but his grip was iron. "Let go of me!" she demanded, her voice breaking against the walls of her home. The wiry man moved in too, his knife grazing the air inches from her cheek. "Shh! No need to fuss." Makes it worse for you. He glanced at his partner. Tie her up. From the pocket of his jacket, the large man pulled a coil of rope, already frayed from use. Mrs. Norris's eyes widened at the sight. She twisted, tried to pull free, but the wiry one shoved her roughly toward the floor. Her knees struck the rug with a muted thud, and pain shot up her legs. Before she could regain balance, the larger man seized her arms and forced them behind her back. The rope bit into her skin as he wound it tight, the coarse fibers scraping against flesh. No, she whispered, her voice muffled against the carpet as they forced her down. She kicked out, but he caught her ankles with brutal efficiency, binding them together as easily as he had her wrists. The wiry one stuffed a rag roughly into her mouth, silencing the cry that rose in her throat. There, the smaller one said with satisfaction, standing over her. Now you just stay put. We'll handle the rest. Helpless Mrs. Norris lay bound on the living room rug. The men loomed above her, shadows within her once safe home. Her chest rose and fell rapidly, breath harsh through her nose, the gag cutting into her lips. She tried to scream, but the sound came out muffled, pathetic. Fury burned within her, but the ropes held her fast. The intruders ignored her now, turning their attention to the house itself. Drawers opened and slammed, wood splintered as they forced cabinets. The wiry one rifled through the sideboard, tossing aside silverware and old letters. The larger man dragged down boxes from the closet, scattering their contents with a sneer. This place is a dump, the big one muttered. Old lady probably doesn't even have anything worth the trouble. The smaller one picked up a framed photograph from the mantel. He turned it, studying the image of a boy in a crisp martial arts uniform, his face solemn, his stance precise. Well, well, he said mockingly. Looks like Granny's proud of her kid. Some karate champ or something. The larger man laughed, a sound like gravel rolling in a barrel. Yeah? Doesn't matter now. Kid's not here, is he? He leaned down close enough for Mrs. Norris to see the malice in his eyes. It's just you. She glared up at him, fury shining even through the fear. She could not speak, but her eyes said what her mouth could not. The wiry one placed the photo back crooked, his smile mean. Funny thing about families. They think someone's always going to be around to protect them. But tonight, Grandma, it's just you and us. They returned to their looting, their boots trampling across the carpet, water dripping from their clothes. Mrs. Norris twisted against the ropes, her wrists burning, her legs aching. Each movement only tightened the knots. Her breath grew shallow, her chest heaving. She thought of her son, of his promise when he was young. I'll protect you, Mom. Always. The words echoed in her mind like a lifeline. She closed her eyes for a moment, clinging to them as the sound of rummaging filled the room. She had no way to know if he was near, no guarantee he would walk through that door tonight. But deep inside, a quiet certainty pulsed stronger than fear. He would come. He always did. The storm outside raged on, rain striking the windows harder, thunder rumbling across the sky. The rose bush by the porch bent under the downpour, but still refused to break. Inside, Mrs. Norris lay bound, her heart hammering, her hope stubborn. And the shadows in her house spread deeper, unaware that the night's balance was about to shift. The ropes cut deeper into her wrists with every slight movement, biting into the soft skin until her hands tingled from the lack of circulation. Mrs. Norris lay on her side, the carpet pressing rough patterns into her cheek, the gag forcing her jaw painfully wide. The rain outside had grown heavier, drumming against the roof like 1,000 impatient fingers, as though the storm itself demanded entry. The house, once warm and welcoming, now felt like a cage. Every sound in the room seemed amplified in her vulnerable state. The scrape of drawers being opened and ransacked, the dull thump of boxes pulled from closets, the crash of something fragile striking the floor and shattering into pieces, all of it pierced through her senses, each noise a violation. She could hear the men breathing, laughing, muttering curses to each other as they tossed her life aside as though it were nothing more than trash. One of them, the wiry one, crouched near her at one point, his knife dangling casually from his hand. He tilted his head as he studied her, his smile sharp and cruel. Still awake, huh? Good. Hate when they faint too soon. His voice carried a mocking, sing-song quality that made her stomach turn. She glared at him, eyes wide with fury even as tears of frustration threatened to fall. He only chuckled, straightening up to kick over a small wooden box that had sat on a shelf for decades, scattering its contents onto the rug. The larger man grunted as he shoved aside a chair to reach the cabinet behind it. "This place is a dump," he said again, his tone laced with irritation. "Waste of time." "Maybe," the wary one replied, digging through the drawers. "But sometimes it's the dumps that hide the best surprises. Jewelry, cash, maybe even a gun she's too old to use." He shot a glance down at Mrs. Norris. "You got any of that, Grandma? He crouched low again, his face close enough that she could see the faint scar that traced his jawline. "Bet you do. Bet you've got something real nice stashed away." She tried to turn her face away from him, but the gag prevented her from even drawing a full breath. He laughed, stood, and moved on. Her body ached already from being bound so tightly. The ropes around her wrists had been tied with rough precision, the kind of knot that only tightened as she struggled. Her ankles were no better, cinched so close together that the circulation in her feet had already begun to dull. Every attempt at movement sent new spikes of pain through her body, reminding her that there was no escape in force. And yet inside her chest, something burned. She was not a woman given to panic. Fear lived there, yes, growing sharper with every minute that passed, but beneath it was a stronger current, a stubborn resolve. She thought of her son. Images flashed through her mind, vivid and powerful. Chuck at 8 years old, falling again and again during his first martial arts practice, only to rise each time, sweat running down his small face, determination in his eyes. Chuck as a teenager, his fists wrapped, standing firm even after being knocked down in sparring. Chuck the man, standing tall on stages, his name spoken with respect across the world. And yet in her heart, he was still the boy who once knelt beside her after a long day and said, "Don't worry, Mom, I'll protect you, always." She clung to that memory now as the storm raged outside. It was not a promise she had ever demanded from him, but one he had given freely, with all the fierce loyalty of youth, and she had believed him. Even now, with her body aching and fear pressing down like the weight of the storm, she believed him. The wiry intruder's voice broke through her thoughts. "Look at this junk," he said, holding up a small silver locket. He snapped it open, glanced inside, then barked a laugh. A picture of her and the boy Wonder. Figures. He tossed it carelessly onto the floor, where it landed near her bound hands. She reached for it instinctively, but the ropes held her fast. He noticed and grinned. "Oh, you care about that, do you? Sweet. Real sweet. Too bad caring doesn't get you anywhere tonight." The larger man joined in with a harsh laugh, throwing a stack of old magazines onto the floor. She thought she was safe here. That's the funny part. Thought she could just sit all cozy while the world moved on. Bet her son doesn't even visit her. At that, Mrs. Norris's eyes flashed, though the gag muffled any sound she tried to make. Her anger flared hotter than her fear. They could mock her, they could tie her down, but they could not rewrite the truth. He did visit. He would come. She knew it with every fiber of her being. The wiry one crouched again, this time pressing the flat of his knife against her cheek, not hard enough to cut, but enough to sting with the cold of the steel. "You're shaking," he said softly, almost tenderly. "Good, that's what I like to see." The larger man grunted. "Quit playing. We need to finish up before anyone notices." "Who's going to notice?" The wiry one shot back, smirking. "She's alone. Neighbors are too far off. The storm covers the noise. We could stay all night and nobody would even know." Mrs. Norris's heart pounded harder, her body trembling not only from fear, but from fury. They thought she was helpless, that no one would come. They thought she was alone. The storm seemed to answer her anger, thunder rolling so loud it rattled the windows, lightning flashing through the curtains in a burst of white. The wiry man glanced at the window, then back at her, his grin unwavering. "Even the sky's on our side." But she knew better. She closed her eyes, breathing as deeply as the gag would allow, and focused on that single promise echoing in her memory. I'll protect you, always. Minutes dragged on like hours. The men grew more reckless in their looting, their frustration spilling into curses as they found little of value. The larger one knocked over a lamp in irritation, and it shattered, the sound sharp as gunfire. Mrs. Norris flinched but kept her eyes fixed on the door, as though by sheer will she could summon her son through it. She pictured him walking in, shoulders squared, that calm, unshakable presence filling the room. She pictured the way he could silence even the boldest man with a single look. She pictured his strength, not just of body, but of spirit, the strength that had carried him through battles far greater than this. And though bound and gagged, though the ropes cut deep and the storm raged on, she held on to that vision. It was her anchor, her shield, because somewhere out there in the night, she knew he was coming. And when he walked through that door, everything would change. The storm howled louder, rain battering the windows with relentless force. Inside, the intruders continued their chaos, blind to the certainty that their night of power was slipping away. And Mrs. Norris, bruised and bound, clung to the stubborn hope that had carried her through every hardship of her life. Her son was coming home. The storm outside had become a living thing, rattling the old house with every gust of wind, hammering the windows with sheets of relentless rain. Inside, the two intruders carried on their destruction with rising frustration, their movements louder now, less cautious, as though convinced no one could possibly hear them through the howl of the weather. The wary one kicked at a chair, sending it scraping across the floorboards, while the larger man rifled through the pantry, muttering under his breath about wasted time. Mrs. Norris lay on the floor, her wrists and ankles burning from the ropes, her body stiff with strain. Her breath was shallow against the gag, her heart a frantic rhythm that seemed to beat in time with the storm. Yet despite the pain, despite the fear, her eyes remained fixed on the front door. She could almost imagine the sound of boots on the porch, the creak of hinges, the sudden shift of air that always announced his presence. That vision had carried her through the long minutes of torment, and when the sound finally came, the sharp rattle of a key in the lock, it was so sudden, so familiar, that she nearly wept with relief. The wiry intruder froze first, his head snapping toward the door. "What the hell?" he hissed, his grip tightening on the knife. The larger man straightened slowly, his broad frame tense, his eyes narrowing. Neither of them had expected this. The door swung open with a groan, letting in a gust of cold, rain-scented air. And there, framed in the threshold, stood the man they could never have prepared for. Chuck Norris stepped into the house as though he had never been gone, rain dripping from his coat, his boots heavy against the floorboards. His presence filled the room instantly, altering the air itself. It was not just his size or the weight of his steps. It was something deeper, an aura that seemed to shift the balance of the world inside that little home. For a long moment, there was no sound but the storm. Chuck's eyes moved once around the room, taking in the scattered drawers, the broken lamp, the overturned chair. Then his gaze fell to the rug where his mother lay bound and gagged, her cheek pressed to the floor, the ropes biting into her wrists, the faint redness of her skin, the humiliation of her restraint. It all burned into him in an instant. His jaw tightened, his lips flattening into a hard line. But his voice, when he finally spoke, was calm. "You struck my mother." The wiry man gave a short, nervous laugh, trying to summon bravado. "Hey, look, this ain't what it looks like." Chuck's eyes shifted to him, and the words died in his throat. Those eyes were steady, cold as iron, unwavering. The wiry intruder swallowed hard, suddenly aware of the knife in his hand, as though it had become a toy instead of a weapon. The larger man stepped forward, trying to reclaim control, his voice gruff. "This doesn't concern you. Back off and we'll leave. No one has to get hurt." Chuck didn't move. He removed his wet coat with one deliberate motion, laying it carefully across the back of a chair, his gaze never leaving the men. Each movement was controlled, grounded, as though every detail mattered. He stood between the intruders and his mother, his presence a wall they could not pass. "You've searched enough," he said evenly. "Now you're going to walk out that door." The wiry one shifted uneasily, his knife trembling in his grip. You don't tell us what to do. We're the ones holding the blades here. He lifted it slightly, but even he heard the weakness in his own voice. Chuck took a step closer, unhurried, his body loose but ready. You don't understand, he said, his tone almost quiet, but weighted with something undeniable. This isn't your line of duty. This is my home, my mother's home. And you've crossed a line you can't uncross. The larger man barked a laugh, though it sounded hollow. Big words. You think you can stop us? He glanced at his partner, then at Mrs. Norris, still lying helpless on the floor. His chest puffed up as though trying to reclaim the dominance that had evaporated the moment Chuck stepped inside. Chuck didn't answer right away. His gaze flicked briefly to his mother, her eyes wide and glistening with both pain and relief. She met his stare and gave the smallest nod, a reminder, a plea, and a warning all at once. Be careful. He inclined his head slightly in acknowledgement, then returned his focus to the men. You're going to regret raising your hand in this house, he said finally, his voice low but cutting. The wire one's smirk twitched, faltered. He licked his lips nervously, then raised the knife higher as though to hide his fear. The storm outside punctuated the tension with a crash of thunder, lightning flashing through the window and illuminating the room for an instant in white brilliance. It was as if the heavens themselves leaned close to witness what was about to unfold. For a long moment, no one moved. The house held its breath. The storm pressed against the windows and the balance of power trembled between arrogance and certainty. Then the wiry man lunged, but Chuck was already moving. The wiry man lunged forward, his knife glinting under the dim lamplight, the blade slicing the air in a clumsy, desperate arc. He was quick, but not quick enough. Chuck's left hand shot upward with precision, his palm catching the man's wrist mid-swing, halting the knife in the air. The impact was dull, final, and before the intruder had time to understand what had happened, Chuck twisted his grip with practiced ease. Pain shot through the robber's arm, a cry ripping from his throat as the knife tumbled from his fingers and clattered uselessly onto the rug. The larger man roared, charging with the reckless momentum of brute force. He swung wide with his fist, a blow meant to crush, but Chuck sidestepped fluidly, his body moving like water, redirecting the strike past him. In the same breath, he pivoted, driving his foot into the man's stomach with devastating precision. The air left the intruder in a choking grunt, and his massive body stumbled backward, crashing into the coffee table. Wood splintered under his weight, the photographs rattling on the mantel from the force of the impact. Mrs. Norris, bound on the floor, watched with wide eyes, her heart pounding so hard it hurt. She had seen her son fight in tournaments, on television, in demonstrations where the audience cheered every strike. But this was different. This was no stage, no performance. This was survival, justice, fury honed into control. Her fear was tempered by awe as she saw the promise of years ago taking shape before her eyes. The wiry man, gasping and clutching his arm, scrambled backward, reaching desperately for the fallen knife. Chuck's foot pinned it to the rug before the robber's fingers could close around it. Calmly, deliberately, Chuck lowered his gaze to him. You don't raise your hand against a woman in my family, he said softly, his voice like steel wrapped in velvet. Ever. The smaller man's face twisted with pain and fear. He tried to mask it with defiance, spitting to the side. You'll pay for this. You're the aggressor here. Chuck tightened his grip on the man's wrist, just enough to make the bone groan under the pressure, enough to remind him of the truth. I'm not your aggressor, he replied, his tone measured, calm. I'm your lesson. With one controlled movement, he twisted further, forcing the wiry man onto his knees. The intruder cried out, his pride breaking as surely as his stance. The larger robber, recovering from the kick, forced himself to his feet with a growl. His face was twisted with rage, his chest heaving. He reached for his belt where a second knife gleamed faintly. Pulling it free, he advanced again, this time slower, wary but still certain that brute strength would give him victory. Chuck released the wiry man with a shove, sending him sprawling to the side, and turned his full attention to the larger opponent. Their eyes locked, predator to predator. The robber swung, a heavy downward slash meant to intimidate as much as to injure. Chuck stepped inside the arc of the blade, his right arm snapping upward to deflect it, his forearm colliding with the attacker's wrist in perfect timing. The knife flew wide, the man's balance broken. In the same fluid motion, Chuck's other hand shot forward, striking the robber squarely in the chest with a palm strike so precise it sent him stumbling back again. But Chuck didn't give him time to recover. He stepped forward, hooked his leg behind the man's ankle, and with a smooth sweep sent him crashing onto the rug. The knife slipped from his hand and spun harmlessly across the floor. The larger man groaned, clutching his side, but Chuck stood over him, calm and steady, his chest rising and falling with the ease of someone who did not need rage to fuel him. He was discipline made flesh, a storm contained in human form. The wiry intruder, still clutching his twisted arm, crawled toward the door as though escape were possible. Chuck's voice stopped him cold. "Stay." Just one word, but it carried the weight of a command that brooked no argument. The man froze, his body trembling. Chuck looked at them both, the quiet of his tone more terrifying than any shout could have been. "You thought this house was easy prey. You thought she was alone. You thought knives and fear made you strong. But strength isn't about cruelty. It isn't about control. Real strength is protection. Real strength is respect. And tonight, you learn what happens when you forget that." The larger robber groaned again, trying to push himself up, but Chuck was already moving. He knelt swiftly, his hands closing on the man's wrists, folding his arms behind his back, in a hold that stole all leverage, all fight. The robber thrashed once, but the movement only deepened the pain. His growl turned to a grunt of surrender. The wiry one sat trembling, sweat streaking his face, his earlier bravado gone. He watched as Chuck subdued his partner with terrifying ease, each motion efficient, calculated, merciful only in that it stopped short of breaking bones. Mrs. Norris, still bound, felt tears prick her eyes, not of fear now, but of pride. She saw her son as the world did not often see him, not on a stage, not in lights, but here in her home, calm in the face of violence, unshakable in defense of what mattered. The larger man hissed through clenched teeth. "You'll regret this. We've got friends. You don't know who you're messing with." Chuck leaned slightly closer, his voice quiet, almost gentle but sharp enough to cut through the storm outside. "No," he said. "You don't know who you were messing with. You walked into the wrong house, and you tied up the wrong woman." He paused, tightening the hold until the man groaned louder. "You tied up my mother." The words hung in the air like a verdict. Thunder crashed outside, rattling the windows as if the sky itself agreed. Slowly, deliberately, Chuck rose, leaving the larger robber subdued and groaning on the rug. He crossed the room to his mother, kneeling beside her. His hands moved gently now, untying the knots with the same precision he had shown in subduing the men. The ropes fell away, and he removed the gag, his touch careful against her bruised skin. "Are you all right, Ma?" he asked, his voice softer now, the storm inside him tempered by concern. She drew in a shaky breath, flexing her sore wrists. "I will be," she said, her voice steadier than her body felt. She looked at him with eyes that glistened with both pride and relief. "I knew you'd come." He gave her the smallest nod, a flicker of a smile ghosting his lips before fading back into focus. He stood, turning once more to the intruders. Both men lay beaten, their arrogance stripped away, their fear as clear as the storm pounding against the windows. Chuck's voice was calm, but it carried the weight of judgment. "Now you're going to sit here and think about the line you crossed. And when you leave this house, you'll remember this night every time you look in the mirror." Neither man answered. They didn't need to. The lesson had been taught. For a long moment after the fight was finished, the only sounds in the house were the storm battering the windows and the ragged breathing of the two men on the floor. Chuck stood in the center of the living room, his shoulders squared, his chest rising and falling with perfect control. He wasn't winded, not shaken, not even disheveled from the scuffle, as though the chaos that had just unfolded were nothing more than another drill in a lifetime of discipline. The intruders, by contrast, lay in broken heaps of their own arrogance, their knives scattered, their bodies subdued not only by pain, but by the knowledge of who they had chosen to cross. Chuck turned away from them, kneeling once again at his mother's side. He had already freed her wrists and ankles, but now he checked them carefully, running his fingers lightly over the angry red marks where the rope had bitten into her skin. "Does it hurt?" he asked softly. She shook her head, though her voice wavered slightly when she answered. "Not as much as it could have. I've been through worse, Chuck. But this—" She lifted her eyes to his, her expression proud and unflinching, despite the exhaustion in her face. "This was the first time I thought I might not see you again. And then you walked through that door." He gave a faint smile, a rare and fleeting thing. "I told you once, a long time ago, I'll protect you, always." Her lips curved into a small smile of her own, though her eyes glistened with unshed tears. She nodded but said no more, trusting that nothing else needed to be spoken between them. Chuck rose slowly, his movements measured as he crossed to the telephone on the side table. He picked up the receiver, dialed with calm precision, and when the operator's voice answered, his tone was as level as if he were ordering dinner. "This is Chuck Norris. 2 men attempted a home invasion at my mother's address. They are alive, subdued, and waiting for you to collect them. Send units immediately." He gave the address and set the receiver back onto its cradle with a quiet click. The wiry robber groaned from his place on the rug, still clutching his twisted arm. "You'll regret this," he muttered, though his voice was weak, brittle, stripped of its earlier bravado. Chuck walked over to him, crouching until their eyes were level. The man tried to look away, but Chuck's gaze pinned him, unwavering and cold. "No," Chuck said quietly, the calm of his tone far more terrifying than any shout could have been. "The only regret tonight belongs to you. You thought fear made you strong. You thought knives gave you power, but you learned the truth. And the truth is this: you tied up the wrong woman." The man swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing as he struggled under the weight of the words. He said nothing more, only lowered his gaze to the floor, his hands trembling. The larger man shifted against the rug, wincing as he tried to roll onto his side. You'll see us again," he rasped, though even he seemed unsure of the threat. His eyes darted to the door as though wishing to run, but his body betrayed him, too sore and battered to rise. Chuck didn't even glance at him. He stood, his attention returning to his mother, who had made her way carefully into a chair near the window. She sat upright, her hands folded neatly in her lap despite the lingering pain in her wrists. The bruise on her cheek was already darkening, the mark of humiliation and violence that no mother should ever endure. Yet her posture was regal, her chin lifted, her gaze steady. She looked less like a victim and more like a queen awaiting her champion's return. "You should rest, Mom," Chuck said gently, coming to stand beside her. "I will once this house is quiet again," she answered. Her voice was tired but firm. "You shouldn't have had to fight in your own home. But I knew the moment they struck me that the storm was on its way. And then it came through the door in the shape of my son." Thunder cracked outside almost on cue, shaking the glass panes. Chuck allowed himself a faint smile at her words, though his eyes remained fixed on the intruders. He picked up one of the knives from the floor, turned it in his hand thoughtfully, then set it on the mantel, far out of their reach. The gesture was almost ceremonial, as though he were returning a tool to its rightful place, making order out of chaos. Minutes passed, heavy and thick with silence, until the sound of sirens pierced faintly through the storm. Blue and red lights flickered against the wet walls of the house as 2 cruisers pulled into the drive. Doors slammed and footsteps pounded across the porch. A firm knock rattled the front door. "Police! Open up!" Chuck moved calmly to the entrance, unlocking it with unhurried precision. When the officers stepped inside, they were greeted not with the chaos of a crime scene, but with the calm after a storm. The 2 robbers lay on the rug, beaten but alive, stripped of their weapons and their pride. Mrs. Norris sat upright in her chair, her bruise stark but her eyes steady, and Chuck stood tall, arms folded, his presence commanding the room without need for explanation. The officers hesitated, taking in the scene. One of them bent to cuff the larger man, hauling him roughly to his feet. The other secured the wiry one, who winced and muttered curses under his breath. Neither offered resistance now. Their fight had been taken from them the moment the door had opened to reveal the wrong opponent. As they were let out into the storm, Chuck followed them to the threshold. The rain pelted his face, soaking his shirt in seconds, but he did not flinch. He leaned slightly toward the wiry one, his voice low enough that only the two intruders could hear. "You'll tell this story for the rest of your life," he said, "and every time you do, you'll remember what I told you tonight. Strength isn't in fear. It isn't in weapons. It's in protection. If you ever forget that again, if you ever raise your hand to another woman out of arrogance, I'll find you, and the lesson will be finished." The men said nothing. They only ducked their heads against the rain and let themselves be pushed into the back of the waiting cruiser. The doors slammed shut, the engine roared, and soon the lights disappeared into the storm. The house grew quiet once more. The clock ticked steadily in the kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator returning to fill the silence. Mrs. Norris exhaled slowly, as though finally releasing the breath she had been holding since the night began. Chuck closed the door, shutting out the storm, and turned back to her. She was watching him with that same look she had worn his entire life, the one that mixed pride with worry, love with an unspoken acknowledgement of the burden he carried. "You didn't have to go that far," she said softly, though her voice carried no reproach. "Yes, I did," he replied, his tone calm but resolute. He moved to sit across from her at the table, the very spot where her untouched cup of tea still sat cold. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the wood. "Because people like them believe strength is control. They believe fear is power. Someone has to show them they're wrong. Someone has to remind them what real strength looks like." She smiled faintly, shaking her head. "You've always been stubborn." His lips curved into the smallest grin. "And it's kept me alive." They sat in silence for a moment, listening to the rain easing outside, the storm beginning to spend itself. The morning light would come eventually, bright and clear, but for now they were wrapped in the aftermath. Mrs. Norris reached across the table, her hand brushing against his. "Thank you," she whispered. He clasped her hand gently, his touch firm and grounding. "Always, Ma." Outside, the stubborn rose bush on the porch swayed under the last remnants of the storm, battered but unbroken. Inside, in the little house on the edge of town, the warmth returned. The photographs on the mantel gleamed faintly in the lamplight, silent witnesses to the night that would be remembered for years to come. The night two men thought they had found an easy target, only to discover what it meant to trespass against Chuck Norris's family. And as the storm finally quieted, replaced by the soft hush of dripping eaves and the steady ticking of the clock, mother and son sat together in the kitchen, side by side, stronger than any darkness that had dared to cross their threshold. Don't miss what's coming next. Hit subscribe now so you never skip the most shocking and unbelievable stories. Watch the next video right here for twists you won't see coming, and dive into our other videos packed with secrets and revelations you have to see to believe. And if this story stunned you, share it with your friends so they can experience it too.